Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to bring you a story about a case that ultimately brought down what was known as the Defense of Marriage Act that was put before the United States Supreme Court and one of the country's most significant civil rights victories. Together with our guest legal team and client, our guest formulated a strategy to bring down the law. Having lost the case for marriage equality before New York State's highest court in 2006, our guest was determined not to lose again. She's known to coin the term, "It's all about Edie, stupid," to constantly remind herself and the team that the case was really about, and that refrain aptly describes what we're going to be talking about today. The book is Then Comes Marriage. It's the United States versus Windsor and the defeat of DOMA. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Roberta Kaplan. Roberta, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know what's really surprising about your book, sometimes when you see something like this put out there, that's something about the law, legal stories, so forth and so on, it can somewhat have sort of a dry read to it, but this one here moves along almost like a Sidney Sheldon novel in ways.
It doesn't have all the sex, I don't think,
just
but you're right.
Turning those pages there. Now, could you ever imagine that you would find yourself in the center of all this as you were going through law school and practicing law?
No. Even before that, as a kid growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, I think if you had told me that when I grew up I was going to be a lawyer in New York, that I'd be an open lesbian, that I'd be married, that I'd have a son, and then that I would win a landmark Supreme Court case, I think I would have told you, and this is a sign of the times back then, I think I would have told you that you were going to too many Grateful Dead concerts and needed to tone it down.
Now, let's really talk about how this all started. This was a case that really was about a couple, Edie Windsor and Thea Spire. And my understanding, this was a 40-year relationship that started quite a long time ago, and this is kind of what shaped all of this to begin with, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's really incredible when we think about it today. Edie and Thea met in the early 60s in New York City at a time when almost any gay person who wasn't, who was middle class or above, had to live their life just completely in the closet. It was just, you would be too marginalized if you lived your life any other way. And they met at a restaurant in Greenwich Village. As far as Edie was concerned, Edie fell in love at first sight. She said that she wasn't so sure Thea did the same. So about 2 years later, they got together. And then 2 years after that, in 1967, they actually got engaged, which is incredible to think that two women, even before the Stonewall movement and what led to the modern civil rights movement, would actually get engaged. And then the heroic part of their life is not even that. The heroic part of their life is what happened for the next 40 years. Thea had MS. They stayed together. They had a Post-it on their refrigerator that said, "Seize joy," and they made sure that they lived by that. And they truly had a marriage in sickness and in health till death did they part.
Now, tell us how this case came to be. I know this had to start with one of the two had passed on, and it seemed that it was all about an estate tax that was being assessed to the living beneficiary, if you will.
Yeah. So basically, when Thea passed away in 2009, and when she died, because of this law that had been signed and put on the books in 1996, when no state was even close to allowing gay people to marry, but because by 2009 they were in fact legally married in New York where they lived. The federal law called DOMA that we challenged meant that their marriage was basically totally invalid for federal law. So while they were married in New York, as far as the federal government was concerned, Thea and Edie were not married. And what that meant is that Edie had to pay a huge tax on all the property that they'd accumulated together as if they had been strangers, as if Thea was just a stranger who gave Edie all her assets. And that's what led to the lawsuit, because Edie, like any American who has to pay an unfair tax, wanted her money back.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about what DOMA actually is for our listeners who may not be familiar with that.
Sure. As I said before, so 1996 is way back in time. The country was a very different place then. And Congress decided that they were going to pass a law that said even though no state in the country is allowing gay people to marry, or even though there really wasn't any prospect for any state to allow gay people to get married anytime soon, if that ever happens, we want to be sure that as far as the federal government is concerned, their marriages are not marriages. It was an incredibly extraordinary thing for Congress to do. It was almost a hypothetical statute when it was passed. The only reason for it, given the fact that there were no gay couples married anywhere, was a fear, at best, a fear of gay people, a hostility to gay people. Flash forward to 2003, when the first marriages started happening between gay couples in Massachusetts, and then to 2009, when Thea died, there were lots of married couples throughout the country, and they had a real problem. Because of DOMA, their marriages were only half marriages, or what Justice Ginsburg has called skim milk marriages. And so that's the problem that we had to fix.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting because during the time you were beginning to educate yourself, moving in the direction of practicing law, you yourself were kind of struggling with identity for a bit yourself, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, for more than a bit. Look,
and then you have something like this starting to appear in your life, and you're thinking, oh, boy, now what do I do? This is a real commitment here.
Well, it's funny because Edie has joked in this case that, you're always coming out in your life. And it's one thing to be an out lesbian, but it was another thing to be the out lesbian who just happened to be suing the United States of America. I'm now the lawyer who represented the out lesbian who sued the United States of America, so I'm pretty out there now, too. But when I was originally going to write the book, I hadn't really thought of talking very much about my personal story. Mm-hmm. I had really thought of it as hopefully not a dry legal book, but at least a legal book. And as I started to organize it, I realized that I couldn't tell the story fully. I couldn't really tell the true story here without talking about my own life and talking about what had happened and being able to explain to the reader, I hope, how incredibly radical and dramatic the change has been in our society from the time I was a young kid in college and law school till today.
I think the challenge, because at the time that we're looking at 2006, more than 68% of the Americans were disapproving of gay marriage, but it seems that tide has turned. What do you think was one of the most significant things that is causing, call it a change of heart, if you will? Yeah, in my Supreme Court argument in the DOMA case, the justices called it a sea change, and there's no question that's what it's been. I think the answer, this was best answered by Edie Windsor herself when we were on the steps of the Supreme Court after my oral argument. And someone asked her this question, and she said, well, what happened is one morning some brave guy got up and got out of bed and had the courage to say to the world, I'm gay. And then another one did it, and then another one did it. And at this point, virtually every American has a friend, a colleague, a family member, a neighbor who's gay. And you know it. They probably had it before, but now they know that they're gay. And once you know and love and respect someone who's gay, it's almost impossible to accept the fact that it's somehow okay to discriminate against them solely because of who they are. So there's no question that people coming out of the closet is what's caused this change. There's no doubt about that, and it's certainly been a huge one. And I think what's interesting about this is how it merges with the United States Constitution and how effectively you were able to use this to be able to show that this really was an injustice when it comes to the inalienable equality of mankind. Yeah, absolutely. Look, the legal principles and the constitutional principles in this case really aren't that complicated. Right. Equal protection of the law means equal protection of the law, and it has to mean that for all Americans. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what this case was about. What had to change, I think, was the way people viewed gay people, to see that gay people had the same dignity as everyone else. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times, too, especially as a couple comes together and they decide children, that becomes the other debate as well. How is this even possible? Wouldn't that cause confusion? But the fact is, if a child's loved and raised and fed and washed and clothed, what more do you really need when it comes to something like that? Yeah, no, that's absolutely, all the studies that have been done over 3 decades show that what matters most for kids is having a stable household with 2 loving parents who care and are concerned about the welfare of that child. And that's the sole determinant of how well kids do, really no other factor, which, of course, is common sense. Now, let's talk about, for instance, what has been gained here. I know that as this was beginning to unfold some years back, I had a concern about how they would actually word the letter of the law in regards to what could be called special interest groups, but this is more direct than that. And to give you an idea, just this year, there was a gentleman out of Montana filing a motion for equality as a polygamist. Now, I know that area that you wrestled with is you were assisting a particular judge who was really hammering away at you about this as they were trying to uncover the clarity of how this should really be presented here.
Yeah. So that's what's called, in legal terms, it's called kind of a slippery slope or red herring argument, the idea that, if we allow gay people, if we respect the dignity of gay people under the law, then we're all of a sudden going to have this huge problem with polygamists. First of all, just as a practical matter, it's not a real problem. I mean, there aren't huge groups of polygamy. I mean, there was that case in Montana, but there isn't a united, huge front of polygamists in this country who want to have the legal right to have multiple spouses. But second of all, and probably even more importantly, it's important to think about the difference between these two issues. That when you tell a gay person that they can't have all the rights that anyone else has with respect to the one person they love, you're discriminating against that person based on who they are, based on their sexual orientation and who they are. Mm-hmm. When you tell someone who's a polygamist that he can have one wife, he just can't have 12 wives, the discrimination is not based on who he is. Discrimination is based on the fact that he wants to have 12 wives. And that's not the same kind of discrimination as what was at issue in DOMA and what was at issue in the gay civil rights movement.
Now, what do you think was probably the most challenging part of all this? As you said, it is straightforward and it seemed, that way, but there was really some complication to go on here, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, the times really changed even during the case. So, in the course of my own life, I did this case in New York in 2004. You mentioned it already, that I lost. Mm-hmm. And we won the Windsor case, only a few years later. And even during the Windsor case itself, I thought we would win probably in the trial court. I probably thought we would win in the appellate court. But I had no idea that we were going to be the case that got to the Supreme Court. And even once we got to the Supreme Court, it was by no means a sure thing. There's a one-vote margin in our decision in a lot of big cases like this. That one vote happens to be Justice Kennedy's. And since winning cases is about getting the votes, you'd like to have more than a one-vote margin, obviously.
Mm-hmm. And did you find that would be the most difficult thing to get?
Yeah, we were very focused. We understood, Justice Kennedy is unique, I think, in the sense that he has completely dominated the area of gay rights on the Supreme Court. Every major Supreme Court decision about gay rights has now been written by Justice Kennedy. And so we knew that we needed to persuade Justice Kennedy. And a lot of what we did in our brief, in the way we structured the case, was done hopefully to make it as persuasive as possible for him.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was a point that it was actually suggested sort of as a thought to Degay the case. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so when you argue a case in the Supreme Court, you go through this process of kind of practice arguments. They're called moot courts. And you sit in a room with a bunch of people, and they pretend that they're the justices of the Supreme Court, and they spend about 45 minutes beating the you-know-what out of you. And then they spend about another hour and a half critiquing every word that you said. So, maybe root canal without anesthesia would be more painful than this, but I'm not even sure. It's not the most fun you can ever have. And during one of those moot courts, and you get lots of different advice from a lot of different people, and some of the advice that I was given was that the way to win the case was that we should de-gay it. We should focus on issues other than the fact that Edie and Theo were gay and was about their equality under the law as gay people. Needless to say, we very much disagreed with that strategy. Our view of the case, we had an opposite saying that we used on our team, which was already married, already gay, which was that anyone that was impacted by this law was already married and they were already gay, and there was nothing the Supreme Court could do that would change either of those two facts. So, what were they going to do about DOMA? Mm-hmm. We really thought that we would win this case if we could persuade the lower court judges, the American people, and ultimately the Justice of the Supreme Court that the marriage and the relationship and the life that Edie and Thea live together is the same as the life that anyone else lives. In fact, who wouldn't want to have a spouse like Edie Windsor, God forbid, if you're diagnosed with multiple sclerosis? So we thought if we could do that, we would win, and, I'm glad we won, let me put it that way.
Now, and going back to the time now, I had served in the United States military in the branch of the Navy, and certainly I had encountered several servicemen who at the time were gay, and that was all right with me. We were good friends, and then eventually, as the years passed as I was out, I noticed there were some changes. One of them, seeing women actually on aircraft carriers, really blew my mind. But the other thing, too, is that they had the don't ask, don't tell policy that was going on. So there was a time I actually had a friend of mine who was a heterosexual, but he somehow got himself in a photograph situation that caused them to question whether or not that he was, and actually got discharged. At the time, you could be for the suspicion of being gay or even bisexual. And
right.
I was really surprised by that. I was like, no, this guy is not either of those things, but you're going to do this based on an assumption. But since that time, it had changed with the don't ask, don't tell policy. But then they had repealed that, but it was because of DOMA that there was some even worse consequences as a result of that really kind of shapes for our listeners who are trying to understand what was gained by the Gay Marriage Act being passed. What do couples actually gain? Let's use that example, for instance, the military example, of how they can come to see what we're talking about here.
Sure. So a lot of things had to fall, as you noted, a lot of things had to fall into place for us to win this case. And one of those was during the litigation, the Obama administration succeeded, and Congress passed a law getting rid of don't ask, don't tell. And so what that meant is that all of a sudden there were not a large number of gay soldiers, openly gay soldiers in the United States military, and not surprisingly, since people who go to the military tend to be pretty often traditional people, a lot of those soldiers were married, and they got married very quickly. But the problem is that under DOMA, they weren't married. And so in military culture, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, when a soldier is injured or, God forbid, died, gets killed in action, it's very important in military culture how the family and the next of kin is notified. And the honor that you give to that soldier is part of the culture when that happens. And what DOMA meant is that even though if it had been a straight married soldier, if God forbid something happened, you would call his wife to tell her what had happened. In the case of the gay soldiers under DOMA, they weren't allowed to call the spouse. They had to call the parent or the sibling or someone else. And I had it on pretty good authority that was just agonizing the Pentagon brass, that the generals in the military thought that was just a horrible thing to do to soldiers who had sacrificed so much. And that was one of the very key arguments that we focused on in the case and in our briefs and in oral argument, because it shows how DOMA was an affront to the dignity not only of gay people, but of gay people who are willing to give their lives for their country.
I know that you share a story in the book about Staff Sergeant Donna Johnson, which really illustrated, the real-world impact of what DOMA was really about. And you take a look at something like this, and I think to myself that somehow, how did that law, first of all, get passed, but it just didn't even seem reasonable because it was more of a morality law, which that can change from person to person based on their beliefs.
Right. No, it's exactly right. I mean, again, going back to 1996, because there were no states back then that even allowed gay people to marry, it was a symbolic law only at the time, really. So what was it doing? What was Congress doing in 1996? As I said before, I think at best they were trying to express a distrust of or a fear of people who seem to be different. And that kind of distrust or fear is something that under our law is what's known as a constitutional no-no. You can't pass a law against a group just because you think they're different.
Yeah, what are you doing here in a country full of immigration in the first place?
Exactly. The Constitution does not permit. That's one thing I can tell you. The Constitution doesn't permit that.
Now, I have a friend of mine, and he happens to be married to the Assistant Attorney General of the state of Oregon. And I had to ask him, because I was curious, what was it that gay marriage didn't have before that it has now, based on this law of being able to be recognized as a married couple? I think maybe a lot of listeners may not really understand what was gained here when it's considered that you are now legally a recognized married couple.
Yeah, so basically, first of all, the main difference, of course, since this June is that gay people can get married in all 50 states. Mm-hmm. And when we argued the DOMA case, that wasn't true. The numbers changed dramatically even during the case. When we filed Edie's case, only 5 states. It's almost incredible to think about now. Only 5 states allowed gay couples to marry. When I argued the case, only 9 did. When we won, 12 did. And when the Obergefell case was argued this past year, 37 states did. Mm-hmm. So now in any case, it shouldn't be. It's obviously crazy to have a country where a gay couple could be married, in Michigan and then move next door to Indiana and not be married. Obviously, that's crazy, and our Constitution doesn't permit that. So that got taken care of. And what it means, there's a huge number, obviously, of practical benefits and responsibilities that come with marriage. Mm-hmm. Marriage, frankly, matters the most when bad stuff happens, right? When someone gets sick, God forbid, or they die, or a couple splits up and you have to decide what to do with the kids. That's when marriage really matters, and gay people didn't have any of those protections. So now they do. The other thing that's probably equally as important, I would say, is this sense of dignity. I don't even think that I fully appreciated that when we won this case and when the world changed, even I had been carrying this weight on my shoulder about feeling less than because of having these laws on the book. And taking these laws off the books has done wonders, I believe, not only for gay couples nationwide, but for gay kids growing up and worrying that they aren't as good enough and thinking about running away from home or having, God forbid, thoughts of suicide. I think we've just made an enormous difference for those kids.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would also believe, too, during all of this, that probably one of the hardest tides that you probably had to stem was that of the religious right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a lot of obsessions. I'm kind of a compulsive person, as you can imagine. And
you have to be when you're a lawyer, right?
That's true. And one of my obsessions in the case was the religious stuff, because I think that our movement, the gay civil rights movement, had made a bit of a mistake in ceding the religious arguments to the other side. And what I mean by that is it's not true that the religious view of gay equality takes only one side. It's not only anti-gay equality. There are many, many, many religious groups out there, and mainstream religious groups, who believe, as I do, that every human being was created in the image of God. And if you believe that every human being was created in the image of God, then every human being has dignity, and has dignity in God's eyes. And that means they have to be treated with equal dignity. So I was very focused on building that case at the Supreme Court. We ended up with a brief that had a lot of mainstream religious groups on it that made essentially that argument. And not everyone on that brief necessarily allowed, at the time, gay couples to marry in their churches or synagogues. Mm-hmm. But they said it doesn't matter what we allow in our church or synagogue. For purposes of the government, it has to treat everyone with equal dignity under the law.
Mm-hmm. It certainly makes a lot of sense. I know it's interesting when at time to time, you run into that hardcore religious believer and the idea about God. And I remember one time I kind of left somebody swirling on a very simple argument about the whole thing and said, so you believe in God, you believe we're made in God's image. Yes, that's true, okay. And yet you're saying that we're imperfect. Is that what you're telling me? Yes, that's what I'm telling you. Well, then that would mean that God is capable of making imperfect things. So why are we calling him perfect? I don't know. It's just silly stuff.
There's no question that God certainly made us as imperfect things. No question about that one.
Always having fun with the experiment here. What has been the most exciting, besides the outcome for you, about what has been happening? What I see around me is it actually seems to feel like the energy has lightened here in this country.
Yeah, I think, let me tell a personal version of that, because I think that's absolutely right. About a couple months after we won the case, I have a son who was then 7, and we decided to stay home for a family movie night. And I kind of put my foot down, and I said, I cannot watch another Disney cartoon. We're going to pick a movie that I choose tonight, and hopefully you'll like it. And so I chose My Fair Lady. And my son, I'm proud to say, had rapt attention throughout the whole movie. He loved the movie. And at the end, he said, I have a question. And we said, sure, what's your question, Jacob? And he said, I guess this is an old-fashioned movie. And we said, yeah, it's old-fashioned. He said, yeah. He said, I guess this movie was made before men could marry men.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a couple seconds to get it, but when the light bulb went off in my head and I realized that for my son, something is old-fashioned if it happened before men could marry men, I don't think I've ever had a greater sense of happiness than at that moment.
Mm-hmm. You know, that reminds me of a time when I was in the 6th grade back in the mid-1970s, and we watched this film. It was called Future Shock. And in there they were showing inevitable outcomes of how our future would look, say, in the next 20 or 30 years. And one of those particular scenes in there was exactly that. It was two men at a wedding ceremony getting married. And, of course, one of the classmates, the jokester that he was, says, well, you know, he didn't kiss the bride. But, you know, that's beside the point. The fact that we were a 6th grade class seeing this potential outcome of gay marriage, you know, but it really didn't seem to alarm anybody.
Incredible. Thanks for telling me that story. I didn't know that. That's incredible.
Yeah, you know, and that showed other things like blue hair. We see that all over the place now.
We see that all the time.
It's amazing stuff. I want to thank you for taking the time on this. Again, I'm looking forward to finishing the book here. And is there a website people can find out more and how they can get a hold of the book?
There sure is. You can go to it's just my name, www.robbiekaplan.com. And there's all the information about where to buy the book, reviews of the book, interviews of me. Hopefully this one will be up there soon, too.
Absolutely, it sure will. Then Comes Marriage is the book, United States versus Windsor, and the Defeat of DOMA. Our guest today, Roberta Kaplan. Roberta, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend.
You bet.